So let me, again, I think the format works best. Let me throw out a question and ask each of the panelists to answer in their own way. So one thing I'd like to say, and looking somewhat through a party lens, is what did the midterms tell us about the two parties? And this can be either in terms of who showed up, who didn't show up, were they in a good mood or a bad mood, or were they grumpy, were they energized, and how you drag them out. And so, or did you have to drag them out? And related to that, had the results of the midterm, or the way the races were run, change the parties, or do they portend to change either how the Dems or the Republicans approach things? And I'd like to ask Karen to start, only because we have to go left to right or right to left. And she actually is, I would say, fresh from the trenches. And in fact, the trenches are still being dug in Georgia. So she ran Stacey Abrams' campaign. And I thought, as we see the results still unfolding, you've got the latest data. Karen?
Yes, in fact, the Secretary of State, thanks to Brian Kemp, just pulled the data off the website, so I can't tell you what the latest data is. So we're fighting that in court, so that's the latest as of this morning.
You heard it here first.
What I would say, I think there's two things I would point to, and I think these are challenges for both Republicans and Democrats, because, one of the unanswered, I think, issues out of 16, and Joel and I and a couple of other of our colleagues from Hillary's campaign talked about this at Harvard, is the role of racial changes in this country, because polling so often focuses so much on what happened but not why. So in 16 everybody was focused on these white working class voters right at the end, but then it turned out that what people were, it wasn't just that when voters would say things like I'm worried that my kids won't have the same future that I do. A lot of that was because they were thinking about Latinos, being told Latinos are going to take your vote, black people are going to take your vote, women shouldn't be in charge. So I think there were a lot of issues, and Dan Balls made a great point on a panel that we were on that I think is still an issue, and his point was in 16, Trump did a better job of taking advantage of the demographics of sort of 16 and the recent past, and we didn't do a good enough job, if you take out all the other things we could have done better, of taking advantage of the electorate as it was and the future. And when I look at 18, and certainly in the Georgia race, in Texas, in Florida, and a lot of these races, that's what I think is really key. I mean, I think Democrats were able to, and I think a lot of people use the Obama model of expanding the electorate. We had 1 million more people vote in Georgia in 2018 than in the last midterm. There was a very intentional program to identify those voters and stay in contact with them for the course of a year and really turn them out. And I think if you look at Beto's campaign and you look at Florida, I think if you look at a lot of races, there was an opportunity for Democrats to expand the map. Now, part of that, I would argue, is because Trump did one of the things, the damage I think he's doing to the Republican Party is shrinking their demographics. I think it is for people of color. I mean, there was a time when the Republican Party, right, was trying to reach out to Latinos and women and be more women-friendly, right? And
I remembers those days.
Right, no, but I think, unfortunately, if you look at, my God, the President of the United States of America tweeted an ad that even Fox News had to take off the air. And I was surprised in the last panel, nobody was willing, I always feel like, okay, I'll say it, race is a big deal. And, one of the things we saw is also, there's still a lot of voters who don't know if they think women are qualified to be executive leaders. And that's, even though we got 4 female Democratic governors, it's still a huge hurdle for women. So I think, going forward, looking kind of ahead, I think for the Democrats, it's, okay, we've brought in more small donors, more volunteers, more potential, more Democrats. We have to make sure that we do the work, and I think the DNC is trying to do this, to hold on to those people and continue to communicate with people and turn them back out. I think the Republican Party is going, maybe not for Trump, but I do think at some point it's, where are you going to get more voters? Where are you going to get, because, where are they going to come from if you keep alienating groups of people? And then the second thing I would say, which goes to that, is really ground game. I think one of the things, and I think this was big mistake we made in 16. We did not do enough on the ground game and relied far too much on analytics. And I think this time around you saw a lot more campaigns do a better job of using both. And I think that is a hallmark. Joel made this point on the last panel. You have to find ways to communicate with voters all the time. You can't just assume, because if you wait till a month before, you're not tracking what messages have they been getting over the last year that have maybe moved them so far away from even being able to consider you as a candidate that you've really got to be there.
The challenges of the Democratic Party and kind of what we learned about ourselves after the election, the first thing that comes to mind is, I think one of the things that we learned is that we look a lot like America, right? And that in itself, in some ways, is a beautiful thing, is a great thing, and it's a challenge. It's like one of our biggest challenges. I mean, the fact is that you take a look at, the Republican caucuses, and, for better or for worse, it is almost all white, it's almost all male. Of the new Democratic Congress people for Democrats, dozens of them are female, I think one of them for Republicans. I mean, our challenges, again, are our strengths. I mean, you can have, these successes of 4 Democratic female new governors. You can have someone like Ocasio in Queens. At the same time, you have Steve Sisolak becoming governor of Nevada, who's this big, gruff kind of trade union guy. We have LBGTQ candidates who won. We have African American candidates. We have Latino candidates. We have, within Latino candidates, we have Puerto Ricans and Haitians, et cetera. And we have this big, big tent, and we had a lot of successes. And in some ways, that also makes it a little difficult and challenging when you think about 2020 and you think about our party caucuses. We, in some ways, don't have this monolithic message that Republicans do in their disciplines, because even on the economic messaging side, think about it. The economic messaging in Georgia 6, the suburbs of Georgia, of Atlanta, where we picked up that seat against Handel, is so much different than the economic message that we picked up in Michigan 11 for Haley Stevens in kind of the Rust Belt of Michigan. So we have challenges that in some ways are byproducts of good things as well because of our diversity, and that's going to continue. The other thing I think our challenge is underestimating is that one of the things that you saw in historic turnout is that I think that Democrats, we kind of had a game plan based on special elections in 2017 and 18, where we were winning these special elections or getting close in these really Republican areas, and these state legislative races we were picking up in Oklahoma and rural Wisconsin and Georgia, and Democratic performance was being outpaced by 10 or 12 points, and we thought that was going to carry over until the 2018 elections. And we had great turnout, but guess what? We underestimated that Trump does a really good job of turning out his people as well. So you have a place like Iowa, for example, that had historic midterm turnout. There was literally 200,000 new people who came in, but guess what? He got his people out as well as us getting our people out. They modeled 6.9 million people, the analytics people, 6.9 million people to get out in Florida, and over 8 million got out. So guess what? What we felt was, oh, hey, people who were surging, getting out because they were angry and pissed at Trump in these special election and giving us double-digit Democratic Performance Index expansion. When Trump came out in the last months, he can engage his people, and he can get his people out. And he showed it in Florida, quite frankly. I mean, I think turnout is going to be the reason, once we start doing the analysis, maybe why we didn't have more victories, why we didn't pick up, the Gillums of the world, why we didn't pick up the Hubbles of the world, is that we can't kind of rest on people just being ticked off at Trump as the accelerant, and that they're going to get out. They did get out. Hubble literally got as many raw votes as Terry Branstad did in 2014. Terry Branstad in Iowa won by 14 points. So we did great. I mean, you could look at it and say, wow, great game. Fred Hubble did 11 points better than the last Democrat and got as many votes as Terry Branstad. but he still lost by a couple votes because guess what? You know, Steve King and Trump did a great job of getting their people, and Reynolds. And so the challenge, there's real challenges there about, you know, what we have to continue doing to even outpace what we're already doing. When you get 17% more voters in Iowa in 2018 over 14, you know, is there much more you can do?
All right, Bettina.
Thank you for being here, and for having me here. I'm excited to be part of this and be one of the official newbies. But I think challenges, definitely women on our side, but I think also for the Democratic side.
Our side would be Republican, just so we
Yeah.
don't make them wear flags.
Yeah,
right? Just so you know
I'm
that.
a very proud Latina Republican. I joke around. I've talked with several people about the Hispanic vote, and my mom is from Cuba, my dad is from Mexico, and the only thing they have in common is they have 2 kids. Like everything is different within those Hispanic communities. But to my earlier point about women, I think that there's clearly challenges on both sides. As a Republican operative, it is saddening to see how few women there are in Congress on the Republican side. We already had about 20. About half of those women ran for higher seats, being governor or senator, and some of them were very successful. And then some of them lost, like in the suburbs, as we saw with Barbara Comstock. And that is something definitely that we are concerned about. But I think, if anything, what makes me excited is there is a renewed interest of that has to be a priority. And I think that you had someone like Elise Stefanik, who was our charge of the NRCC's recruitment, who did a great job of trying to recruit women, and we did get some gains. Like Yum Kim out in California, Korean American, the first Korean American congresswoman who is a Republican that represents us, but we have to do a lot more. And I think one of the challenges for both parties is that and I'm sure this will come up a lot more, the identity politics and the Democrats making it seem that white women who are Republican are traitors to their gender because they don't agree with Democratic women. And I always find it appalling when we assume that half of the country, that is women, has to all agree the same exact way. They all have to have the same point of view. God forbid that we have different points of view and have different priorities, that we care about lower taxes, that we care about the economy, that we see life issues differently. That is seen by some, especially women magazines and women's groups, as being a traitor to your gender, and that I think is completely wrong. And I think that's going to be a challenge on both sides on how do you address that, because it makes women less likely to run for office if they're going to be attacked at that level. And we can talk on and on just how hard it is to recruit women to run for office in this current political environment. But I think that's definitely one of the things that I'm concerned on both sides. Is I'm excited as a woman to see more women coming to Congress, even if they're a Democrat, and I hope that inspires Republicans to get more women there as well. And I think another challenge is a lot of people have talked about like these coalitions, and I think while this group is an incredibly talented group of people who understand politics a lot, I think thinking that be it women or Hispanics are just going to fall in line with Democrats because they don't like Trump, I think is wrong. You saw Trump outperformed Romney with Hispanic voters. Hispanics went about 30% for Republicans in this cycle. And in races like in Florida and Texas, they went about 45% for the Republican candidate. Even in Texas, where you had a Democrat, a woman running for governor, Hispanics supported Abbott, a white Republican sitting governor, by about 45%. So I think we just can't assume that people are just going to fall in line because this narrative that they've created about Trump.
Well, I agree with I agree a lot with what Bettina said, but I think ultimately, if we try to ask ourselves as a party, what do we learn from this last electoral judgment in order to inform better results in future contests, it still comes down to, I think every party has to ask themselves or understand that elections are always contests for the future. and how can you win the sort of people's hopes, dreams, and aspirations? How can you win the battle for those? And I think for the party, one of the big challenges that we will continue to face in an era of Trump is that we are more defined right now by what we're against instead of what we're for. And that fundamental difference, I think that can help in a midterm election, but I think it hurts the future growth of the party and how you can win big policy debates when you constantly define your party that way. So I think that's one of the big challenges that we have. The other thing is, when you have a party that is very centered around its leader, and the leader has a view that they're constantly wanting to draw contrasts with his opponents or his perceived political critics, then you're in this constant feedback loop of looking for positive reinforcement from only your base. And so that is a challenge that we have right now, which is moving beyond just exercising or rallying our base. John is exactly right. This was an election that was very rare for many of us who have worked in midterm contests, where both bases were really excited, right? And usually it's one is somewhat listless and the other one is excited, and it's reflected in the results. But this was one where the bases were both very, very excited, and we had very high turnout. The problem is, for our party, is that we lost some of our core voters in areas that are the most populated, which is the suburban centers. And going forward, if you look at 2020, it used to be that we drew basically a 30-mile radius around places like Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, or Columbus, Ohio, or Denver, and that was, and maybe Orlando, and those were the big battles for how you won in a presidential year. Now, as we saw with this election, you also have to draw a 30-mile radius around places like, Atlanta and Kansas City and Oklahoma City in ways that I think are sort of changing the broader landscape of how we fight our battles. But I think I'd be remiss also if I didn't sort of add to Bettina's point about Republican women. And if you look at the impressive wins by so many women in the Republican Party, Kay Ivey, the new governor of Alabama, Kim Reynolds, the governor of Iowa, Kristi Noem, the new governor of South Dakota. You even had Jeanette Nunez, who is now lieutenant governor in Florida, also an Hispanic Republican woman. Marsha Blackburn in Tennessee, Cindy Hyde-Smith in Mississippi, and even Korean-American Republican woman, Young Kim in California, who won Ed Royce's district, and I think adds favorably to the profile of the Republican Party. Now, those are all really impressive wins from Republican women. One of the problems is that in many of those states, they didn't have the battles that we had in suburban areas, and that is going to be the big test for us going forward, is can we win and win back some of these voters that we lost in some of the big population centers of the country in 2020.
I'm so excited to go last because I have a few things to say. and comments are right. So first, thank you for having us. I want to comment on one of the very first things Ellen said, which is it makes it very hard to think that young people who are watching the stream or are a part of this conference over the next 2 days might want to be a part of politics. And I would tell you, don't take that lead, be a part of politics. Your country's worth it, right? So know that this is the sausage making. And it's actually the most fun, the most painful, and the most joyous experience you can have in life, short of a wonderful husband and a couple of kids, maybe. So, to Bettina's comment about women, I see the challenge on your side. On the Democratic side, we had no problem recruiting women this year. Our chief recruiter was Donald Trump. He just was. And it was, but it wasn't an organized party recruitment, okay? And I want to comment then to race, to Karen's point, and in fact, Bettina, this is where there's some more alignment, and that is the split between women along racial lines. I don't think we know the conclusions of that yet, but boy, it warrants a conversation, okay? Now, I'm going to take us off the elections, and I'm going to switch us over to party. I currently have my dream job, but there's been a part of my life where I really believe being party chair was my dream job. I think it's a great job. I know it's a horrible job on a day-to-day basis. But the question I bring back to the table for everyone is, we all talk about the parties. Can anyone actually define what the parties are anymore? Are they a piece of infrastructure? Are they a message? They're this amorphous beast that I think even in this room we'd have 30 different definitions. For many decades, the definition of the party had a hard definition to what it was. It was infrastructure led by a group of people, primarily white dudes, that created a vehicle for some other force of action to happen, right? As those functions have slowly eroded, more so in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party, not in large part, but in a late influence under President Obama for the Democratic Party, where he chose to operate outside of the party structure. I don't mean just message, I mean operate outside of the party structure, okay? You can argue whether that's good or bad. It has left Chairman Perez on the Democratic side with a shell without consensus among its supporters about what its role is as a national party, and it's left states who were floundering to a certain degree left to really dissolve. And this has allowed for what I consider to be the most critical issue ever for both parties, and that is the performance of third-party voters. If you think all the consultants had a big role in these campaigns, and some of them did, they are brilliant. I'm telling you that there were more races that may have been impacted at the high-level headline races by third-party voters. I say that as a veteran of a 2000 recount for a presidential. I say that as somebody who worked for two people who won the election and were never sworn in as president, and I'm a Washington Nationals fan. I haven't seen a World Series yet. So this function of 0.5%, 1%, 2%, and as both sides become further apart, more extreme in their functions as party structures and party voters, the influence of bringing races closer and closer together by the high turnout that Enzo talks about, right? Which is phenomenal for democracy, it truly is. The closer these races get, that 0.5% of Libertarian, that 1.5% of Green Party, those protest votes are no longer protest votes. Those protest votes are determining votes. And the leaders of both parties better figure out what their role is going to be in elections, get it, live with it, and then answer this function of third-party votes.
So Kiki, just for a minute, maybe for everyone not knowing, define a third-party vote. You mean
A third
not
party
one
is a
Democrat,
non-Republican or
Republican?
non-Democratic vote. So you have different levels of access on different ballots. By the way, along with that goes the function of different voting structures, right? The increased activity around jungle primaries, top twos, which, by the way, as a centrist Democrat, as somebody who comes from the era of the DLC, and as my former boss, Al Fromm, said after 2016, I did this once, it's up to you now. You guys do fix it in terms of the Democratic Party. That I'm all for that, because I am for having functioning elections that encourage people to come to find solution as opposed to provide the most extreme candidate. Not that they shouldn't have a voice. So I'm open to election reforms of those types. But that's what I mean by third party. And in different states, different people are getting access to the ballot in different ways.
Right.
That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm just suggesting, well, I happen to think it's where the vote turnout is a bad thing. But their access isn't. What I'm suggesting is both parties, for their own future, better figure out what that is and how it's happening.
And it is, in your observation, is it a growing, I hear what you're saying, that the margins are so tight that they can, with very small numbers,
Yes.
throw an election, but is the percentage of the electorate generally
Well,
growing
there are
in the
two
third
there are two
party?
things that happens. One's a fantasy and one's reality. Fantasy is people walk around and say, I hate both parties. I wish we had a third party.
Right.
Well, it's really hard to develop a third party around a core of something that's not the same, right? So at its heart, Democrats and Republicans have a core set of beliefs that people organize around, like a maypole, right? If the people who want to argue for a third party, and generically, they can't organize because there's not one set of agreed upon principles that they want to organize around. You do then have some minor functions, Green Party, Libertarians, there are probably a few others named out there, but they're the two most obvious that people would recognize, who organize, but they are in small enough numbers that they unsettle other elections.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Disruptors. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Makes sense.
I did that for Lisa Bennett.
She's furiously typing.
So I want to raise a few specific challenges for each party and get the reaction of the panelists, or at least ones you see. So in New York City, in certain pockets of New York City where I'm from, there is a development of what they call NORCs, naturally occurring retirement communities. Okay, this is somewhat because of rent control and rent stabilization in New York. I won't diverge much, but NORCs. And so I think, as the description says here, one issue we want to raise is for the Democrats, now that they're in Congress, especially in the House, there was this wave of young voters who are obviously behind. I think the average age of the House is now dropped 10 years. The average age of members of Congress in the House dropped 10 years in age. And yet you have your own House version of NORC occurring at the leadership level. You know, and actually the Republicans too. You got Nancy Pelosi at 78, Hoyer at age 79, but not to be left out, Mitch McConnell is 76, and Trump himself at 72, if I did my math right. I was reading off the Wikipedia in Italian, so I'm not sure I quite got it all right. But anyway, you get the idea.
Lynn, Jonathan has one he wants to add. He's.
No, I was just saying Schumer and Durbin are both.
And Schumer and Durbin, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's right.
That's the new 55, John.
No, unfortunately, Senator
Which makes
Schumer
Anton
belies it every
30.
time he goes on the camera with his bifocals, so he can't hide his age at that point. Anyway, so, you know, what's going on there? What is that challenge? It's a separate, I want to keep it separate from the previous panel's discussion of can Nancy hold her troops together? Is she a skilled legislator? I wanted just to raise more broadly, have we hollowed out the bench in leadership to the extent that we start with that and then what do we drop? A lot of new people coming in, but one assumes there's going to have to be somewhat of an arc of experience.
I'll kick it off quickly by pointing out that one of the failures of the Democratic Party has been succession planning.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's legitimate. Don't get me wrong. Over 50, rock on.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
But there should be a little more.
But there's a succession planning function, and that's not just in Congress, but where the best succession planning comes from, which gives me hope after this election cycle, is governor's races.
Yeah.
That's where we get the best succession planning for leadership.
I think, though, part of what you're seeing, I can speak more obviously to the Democratic and the Republican side, and it goes to something Kiki said about the fact that a lot of these amazing people who won were not recruited by the party, right? So that is part of the struggle that I think is happening more broadly in a lot of industries in our country, but certainly in politics, where you have a younger generation of people who are not going to, quote unquote, wait their turn. And good for them, because if they did, I think our party would not be so diverse. It would still be a lot of older white men. All due love and respect to older white men. But so I think that's part of, and again, I think that is something that the party is going to have to reckon with. That is, and to some degree it is because of the nature of the way elections work in different states, that you can be someone who says, you know what, I'm a Democrat, I'm going to run. I know that the establishment is against me, but you can still find enough voters and donors to obviously be successful, which I personally think, having been at the party, although I worked for Howard Dean, so he was a little bit of a disruptor. From the establishment side, that is a challenge, but I think actually for our country and our democracy, and I think in the long term, it's good for the party to have, again, this sort of infusion. But one thing I think is really important, and this speaks very specifically to a lot of the women, there's kind of this mythology that these women sort of, they talk about, Athena springing from Zeus's head. A lot of these women, they have been in the trenches doing the work for a long time. I will speak specifically and give a plug to my cousin, Tish James, who is the first African-American woman elected AG in New York. She was on the city council. She's been in the trenches working, but people sort of story about her is a lot of people don't know where she came from. I think Ayanna Pressley is another example of that. So there's a lot of these women who've actually been doing the work, but we just haven't been paying attention. And I think Ocasio is a great example of someone who, she had worked in her district for Bernie, who's not a Democrat, by the way, I just have to say that. But so she knew the district very well. And a lot of these people are also coming from non-traditional, from backgrounds that maybe aren't necessarily political. And I think that's the other shift that we should talk about, and this kind of also goes to the point Kiki was making, that part of what I think is exciting right now about politics is you don't have to be part of the political party to be engaged, right? There's so many more ways, whether it's Indivisible or it's, it's Sierra Club. I mean, if you have a specific issue that you care about or other ways to be involved and engaged, but you don't want to be a part of the party, which I think is happening on both sides. I think it's why people kind of claim to be independents, even though they may vote a certain way, because it's kind of cool to not be a Democrat or not be a Republican. So I think, part of the challenge that I will add to that for the Democrats, I think we did fairly well this time. We'll have to do a lot better in 2020, which is how do you then pull that coalition together, right? How do you partner as the party with all these outside groups and make sure, for example, one of the issues we had in one of the special elections in Virginia was people's doors got knocked on multiple times for the same candidate by 4 different groups. We got to do better than that and do a better job of working together so that we're actually leveraging all of this energy forward. And again, I think some of these newer, younger candidates and people who were effective at doing that.
I was just going to say, listen, I'm into living in the realm of reality. And, the Schumers and the Pelosi's, and, there was the previous panel talked about, don't underestimate Pelosi, and I agree with that. But the fact is that they are the face in some ways of the party. Democrat, Republican, if you get power, you don't give up power, and they're gonna be there. But there's certain things that Democrats or Republicans can do. Again, going to our Democratic Party chairman, et cetera. We don't have, someone, quite frankly, who I think, I would love you want to talk about someone like Beto O'Rourke. Wow, that would be a good, forget about where he falls on the spectrum. What a great, party chair that guy would be. Someone who can go out there every day and excite people and kind of capture the excitement of the 2018 elections. The other thing goes back to state, where we really should be fighting this up. Where I really care about is I care about the Gretchen Whitmer Democratic Party in Michigan. I care about the Whitmer Democrats. I care about the Sisolak Democrats in Nevada, right? Where, the Roy Cooper Democrats in North Carolina. Because the fact is that we put so much focus on Congress and the Senate, and the fact is that we did more good as Democrats getting Democratic governors, and maybe the biggest wins of the night were getting legislative victories so we could just stop supermajorities on the Republicans. They have to now go and deal with Democratic governors. We have a voice. Redistricting is going to be a big deal. So, all of our best work is, quite frankly, at the state level. And we don't nurture it, we don't pay attention to it. The Senate and the House races become, the shiny object that we keep focusing on when all the good work seems to be happening at the state levels. And I will say this, even though you lost in Georgia, even though we lost in you didn't yet, I'm sorry, may lose, or Hubble in Iowa and some of these places that we lost, again, there was really good stuff going on there. And we tend to we only count W's and L's. I get it, where we are. But if you're in Iowa and you did 11 points better than Branstad did 4 years ago, wow, something must be happening. Tap into it.
Well, and John, what I would add to that is if you look at Texas, says the Texan on the panel, okay, and you look at Beto, I'm also a veteran of Wendy Davis's race in 2014, so we saw everybody do crack and then we got real, right? So, but what was really different about the race in Texas with Beto is it was probably the first time in the last 25 years, and this I think speaks to what a party can do when operating together. Forget the branding of having a DNC or Democrat on a label at a conference or a name. It was a symbiotic relationship between the top of the ticket and the people down below the ticket, right? So Beto O'Rourke did not win the Senate seat. But he sure helped pull those Democratic candidates in the congressional delegation. The second thing that happened is by many of them women in Texas this time around, who were willing to get up and run for the first time in how long did Texas Democrats have a full slate of legitimate candidates, not just name fillers, running that helped up the vote towards Beto. So what I've said to people is the phrase I use is that race turned a lot of dirt in Texas, right? And you can't grow a crop until you've turned dirt. And Texas is now, as Michael, my version of what Michael Steele said,
But
is turned dirt.
Will we fertilize the dirt? That's
Well,
my
that's the-
point.
but that's the
It's like
question.
we just like, we stop.
Right, but
It's
that's.
like we stop.
But that's the
Yeah.
argument for now. What's the role of the party?
Yeah.
That's right.
And where does the party go in and help take that advantage of that turned dirt?
And that goes, I think, to what I was saying, that, in all these states, again, it's new small donors, Beto brought in, Stacey brought in, Andrew Gillum brought in, and also in some of these places, they ran, and I was not actually I did not run the campaign. Like, there is a campaign manager who's a phenomenal woman who comes out of Ohio politics.
We inflate everyone's
And I appreciate
title
that.
and ability.
But
It's
she's
one of
such a
the
rock
things we
star,
do
I don't
at
want to
Catalyst.
take away from her.
I'm president of NYU. You ran the Stacey.
But there you go. But I think, in a place like Texas and in a place like Georgia's never had an Ohio presidential year style campaign. And by that I mean we have a whole cadre now of activists
Trained.
and organizers
Trained.
who know what to do. They've just never had that. And I think also, if you look at Texas and some of these other states, so I agree with John that we do focus so much on congressional races. And if I'm the party chair, I'm looking at all this good stuff that, yes, I have to fertilize, and I do think, to his credit, Perez is trying to invest in the state parties to be able to take advantage of some of these things, and I hope they continue to do that. Because, one of the things I remember in 2016, people kept saying, well, Trump doesn't have an infrastructure in the states. He didn't need one because the Republican Party had one, and he knew that if he just became the nominee, he was going to inherit an infrastructure. And we need to be able, and unfortunately, we did not necessarily in the same way that I hope whoever the nominee is in 2020 does. And so that is also why these down ballot races and this work in the states, it's not the sexy stuff, but it really matters if you have 1 million more voters on the rolls, for example, that you're starting in a lot better place going into your next cycle than you are when you have to figure out where are those people, how am I going to find them, how am I going to find the donors, who am I going to hire?
I think that you're all offering a helpful corrective that you've got to look at the entire party apparatus at all levels and watch some of these interactive dynamics, as Kiki says, of the drawing up the energy. Beto doesn't win, but he helps drive that right down and do some of those races that seem to be the margin of error for them getting in. I think it's also, you've mentioned the head of the Democratic National Committee. I think one of the issues is that is an important role, RNC as well. Are they equipped to take this next challenge on is part of it as well, and I think cultivating leadership. Let me raise one other impediment issues for each party, and maybe this time start with Kevin and Bettina on the Republican side, and Kevin mentioned it. So, and I'll get to the Democrats who can't seem to find a vote in rural America, and the Republicans really having struggles in the suburbs. And is that just the electorate shaking out in a different way, and we live with that as electorates go through? I don't know if any of the experts consider this a realigning election, but as far as I would go, it seems a sorting out election, or the beginning of it. But your views on that?
Well, I think it's,
Suburban.
I'll do it real quick. I think it's the changing profile of the Republican Party into the party of Trump. And, as much as we talk about the never Trumpers, you could probably fit them in a phone booth in most areas. And also, you give them some tax cuts and a lighter regulatory touch, and all of a sudden they don't feel as much of a need to fight against Donald Trump. So in many ways, they've been placated somewhat. And the same thing with the Supreme Court nominations. I think many of them, when it comes down to one of the reasons they held their nose was that they knew that on that question that it was an easier choice to vote against Hillary Clinton than it was for Donald Trump in many elections. So, but to your main question about the suburbs is that is, the resistance that helped Democrats win was mostly driven by, voters that used to be reliably Republican, college-educated white women in suburbs were voting against Donald Trump and for Democrat candidates that they did run on a resistance message, but they also tailored and offered a little bit more of a localized, personalized message on a lot of the issues that that these voters care about, namely healthcare, education, and also, as much as the caravan issue really drove a lot of voters to the polls in exurban areas or rural areas, it really turned off a lot of those women voters in the suburbs, and there was a backlash there. So while the president, I think, has strengthened his hold inside the party and has truly defined the party and reshaped it in his image, and it's worked in some districts, it's been by the risk of losing many voters that were traditionally how you won these majority maker seats. Again, draw that 30-mile radius around some of these key population centers. That's where you win the majority with the moderates. So one of the problems that we have now as a party is that all the moderates, many of the moderates, I should say, have been wiped out. It's a party that is calcified around its support for the president heading into a presidential reelection in 2020.
Well, I think some of the things that were said in the previous panel and looking ahead with the 2020 elections, I think that if I were a Democrat, I'd be worried a few things. Like Tom Perez has talked about Ocasio-Cortez being the future of the party. I think there's a lot of Republicans and moderates that, well, as a Republican operator, I'm like, great, make her the face of the party. And I think it's like, go ahead, I will create your posters. Because I think that will mobilize a lot of people, because I think the reason why Democrats were successful is because you had a lot of these moderates that were winning in suburban districts. But if you move more to the left, I think that opens a lot of opportunities. And then you add Trump, who, whatever you feel, like he has an uncanny ability to make people do, like his enemies, like do stupid stuff and create political suicide to help himself. And I think that the Democrats, I would be worried of overusing their hand and making a lot of opportunities that will help Trump in 2020. And I think that if I were a Democrat, that I would be concerned of moving too far to the left, promoting people like Ocasio-Cortez, giving opportunity for Republicans to say, this is an extreme party, they don't have your best interest, and giving him an opportunity. I actually do think that Trump has a great possibility to win in 2020 for multiple reasons. And I think that if he can focus on the economy and if he can focus on the economy
Fingers crossed.
but I do think, to your other point, like parties don't really recruit people. Like the Republicans don't do a lot of,
I said they think they do.
They think they do, but
This election probably did show a difference if
Yeah,
we're going to get out there.
But I know I've had multiple conversations with the RNC and the NRCC about our need to recruit more women. And they would say, that is great, but our job is to win seats. If there's a great woman there, fantastic, but it is not our priority. And they'll have another panel on women. The Democrat side just has a stronger operation in identifying those people with groups like Emily's List and stuff like that this don't exist on the Republican side. That puts us at a disadvantage. So I know there's another panel that talks about that, but it's like,
We
I think,
got to stay in our lane.
yeah.
But can I say one thing, though, about these suburban white women just in this particular election? A lot of the calculation was not just, are they going to vote against Trump? I was perfectly happy in Georgia, just stay home. If you're not going to vote for my candidate, I'm fine if you're just so mad and you're so mad at your party that you don't want to vote. And I think we overstate how much of the calculation was trying to get those people to vote for us, as much as trying to understand that these are voters who are so angry with their party, or, disgusted with, who thought the caravan was, and that fear-based, race-baiting strategies are bad. Thank you. I'm glad they felt that way. But they didn't necessarily vote for Democrats, and, that was okay.
Yeah.
In 2020, if you're trying to win the presidential, that's a different calculation. It's also a different calculation. The last thing I want to say, just because I think we need to differentiate, how you ran in this election for governor or a state seat is very different than for the Senate or for the House. So for example, House members were dealing with impeachment questions. if you're running for governor, that is not the question. If you're running for governor, a lot of governors, the questions that they got were things like, I mean, part of the reason I think healthcare became
Medicare
such a big issue,
expansion.
Medicaid expansion,
Medicaid expansion.
which in a lot of these states, I mean, the issue landscape really shifted. You're more worried that is your governor going to be for Medicaid expansion than you might have been hearing that from your House person that you were running, who was it running in your district. So I think that differentiator is really important.
You started talking about rural
Yeah.
America,
Yes. Yep.
and again,
I know
to
Ms.
me,
Longhorn
to me,
wants
it's
to
the
talk
biggest.
too.
It's like the most distressing thing for us, because one, it's not as if we're not trying. Stephanie Cutter had mentioned in her panel about Iowa the number of counties that Obama won versus Fred Hubble, even though Hubble did better in narrowing the margin from 2014. And one of the things that I was tasked with in 2012 for Obama was to do this rural strategy, work with Vilsack, and we did a lot of research, and it wasn't to win those counties, it was just to narrow the margin. Don't get so blown out. And we haven't figured out how to do that. Now, in 2016, I think we just didn't pay attention to it. I think a lot of candidates at the governor's levels and Senate levels did pay attention to it, and we didn't get what we thought. Hubble is a perfect example. Todd Harris is here, who did Reynolds. Fred Hubble spent a lot of money in the rural areas. He had a rural strategy. I rode my bike across Iowa in July, and I was doing 100 one-man focus groups in Spencer, Iowa, and talking to older white men who were pissed off at, the soybean tariffs, et cetera. And I was thinking, there's really something going on here. But at the end of the day, they voted against their interests as soybeans just stack up in their silos. And you kind of, if you look at the last 2 weeks of the election, you kind of understand it. I mean, Trump went out there and engaged. Steve King, his flap that made his race a little tighter, it engaged, probably, I think, helped Reynolds at the end when you take a look at the vote in the 4th Congressional District. The tribalism in rural America, which, by the way, is non-college educated America. I mean, that is really an education divide as well as a kind of cultural small town divide. And we got killed. And it wasn't just in, Iowa. It's, I think someone we were talking, it's the Pasco counties of Florida. I mean, we don't think of Florida as a rural area. Guess what? It's a big agricultural place. And once again, we were getting killed in those type of places. So we're sitting there on election night in Iowa, and Fred Hubble was exceeding Obama margins in Polk County, Des Moines, in Cedar Rapids, Lynn County, and then the college towns like Johnston County and Story County, and you're thinking, how can you lose? And then you see the 4th Congressional District coming in. So it's not as if we're not trying. I mean, it is a very divided time, and I think that the rural areas get very tribal at the end. And one of the lessons maybe, again, is, man, Trump can really come in a very short time period and ignite those voters with things like immigration, with just the larger kind of narrative is, hey, I get you. I'm speaking your language. I care about you. And that's what he does in rural America, and we haven't figured it out. But it's not for the lack of trying, actually, this cycle.
Yeah.
You have the last word?
The two elements
You
to
had
this.
the first word. No, you.
I'll take any word I can get. There are two elements to this, I think, and I just came out of a conference of 350 people in Northwest Arkansas about the Heartland, and it wasn't a political conference, right? It was investors, it was philanthropists, it was local leaders trying to recognize what the agenda is for the Heartland, which isn't always rural and small town, right? It's mid-city. So everybody uses rural as a euphemism for anybody that's not in a big urban metroplex, right? And even if you look at the work that J.D. Vance and Steve Case are doing, they're actually looking what are microeconomies of those ex-urban areas, right? So two things. Number one, nobody in those rural areas has had anybody messaging to them about the Democratic agenda or party for a long time, okay? We'll go back to Iowa. Tom Vilsack, one of my greatest mentors and bosses I've ever had, and I would tell you that after a very successful 2 terms as governor, right, a strong Democratic core to their congressional delegation, small town mayors, which he started as one, as Republicans began to strip one seat away after the other. If you're now, and this I'm going to marry this up to what Rob brought up and what we talked about before about the no rest in the messaging, right? If you're in a rural or heartland district that has now been a decade or more as a Republican district, and you get social media, and you only ever hear on the news from a local Republican congressman, and you only ever hear on the radio from a Republican governor, no one has told you what Democrats think, believe, or will do for you, right? So when you have an example like Texas, where you actually had Democrats on TV every day, and they may not have won, but there were Democrats messaging, you begin to undo this. I sat in a board meeting recently where someone said to me from a Heartland location an experience their husband had at the firing range. This guy was a Democrat, 2 other guys there at the firing range, made a comment that was just completely factually wrong. And somebody said, we have to beat those guys. And I said, no, we don't. Somebody taught them that. Somebody taught them that that's who Democrats are. And so what Democrats have to do
Unlearn.
is, and this is going to sound a little like a Howard Dean thing, and I get the value of the pointed win, but we have to begin to message in places and provide voices that have not been heard. So I don't care if Mr. Perez gets on a plane and a train, I don't care if we get Beto and a show, but we need to go where we haven't been before, okay? And not because we're going to win them, but because it is a long haul to bring them back to the table. And so no wonder they're voting where they are. That's all they've heard for the last 12 years, right?
Yes.
So that's the item one. And then the second thing I'll close with is the concept, again, of what the party is, right? Parties do not win elections and govern. Human beings do, right? And so there is a function of leadership of the party. And if I were chairman of the party, and I think what Mr. Perez is trying to figure out and how to do for Democrats, and I would encourage the Republican Party, although they've been better at it than we have, is go build the infrastructure and be the best consulting firm you can possibly be for every Democrat who wants to run for office. Make sure every resource is available to them, and make sure they're available to them in a way they can use them. As a party chair, you are not the President of the United States. You are not the Speaker of the House. You are not the Governor of a state. And recognize the role that you're in and go do it well.
You're the technician, great. Now, do we have time, organizers, for just 1 or 2 questions? We're up 1 or 2?
They're hangry.
Everyone's hungry, right? So
They're
just keep
hangry.
in mind. Sir,
That's right.
it's this one, right?
I'm a total outsider here because I'm a British writer who lives part of the year in Florence, married to an Italian, and probably waiting for my deportation orders if Brexit happens. Now, I look, the United States and the rest of the world, and there are, so many problems that need to be resolved. And, I wonder, it's not only in America, every single country, politicians seem to have lost their focus on doing something for the country and only interested in their own power and interest. Now, in America, there are, we see what's going on at the moment. There's massive inequality, forest fires, infrastructure problems, etc., and racist problems. Don't you think that there should be more consensus between the parties to sort out America? A divided America like Union European, which is also divided.
Kevin, you go.
Okay,
Go ahead,
Kevin.
Kevin, it's you.
I have a very, that's a really meta question. I don't have I guess I'll have a very meta answer, which is none of those are new. Infrastructure issues, problems between race problems, and self-interested politicians, these weren't invented since Donald Trump became president. I think the problem, one of the big problems that we have is the forums to focus on, and the incentives out there to focus on areas where we agree and can craft solutions versus the ones that exploit the differences and elevate and provide and provide amps for the dissent. And I think that's one of the big problems I think right now, which is that everybody is very comfortable in their own echo chamber. They're not interested in finding out another viewpoint. They're interested in hearing a positive feedback loop on Fox News or MSNBC, depending on which side of the aisle that you're on. So I think the challenge, and look, one of the main one of the main groups to blame on this, the voters. They keep sending people back.
Sending people
You find
back.
let's find all the moderates, the people that tend to work across the aisle because there should be political incentives to do so. Oh, they lost. Okay, yeah, so there's fewer of them right now in Congress than there were. before. So I just think it's one of those things that's rewarding people that do reach across the aisle and try to find bipartisan solutions to big problems. Right now, we're in a political system that sort of punishes those folks.
So, there's time, I have 4 kids, and sometimes we make them spend time with us, and we call it forced family time, right? And the fact is that because of redistricting, you get in these states where you have a Republican governor and supermajorities, or a Democratic governor and supermajorities, and they don't have to talk to the other side. So you can have Roy Cooper, who's a client, become governor of North Carolina. He's a great guy, and you have supermajorities on the Republican side, and they just screw with him the entire time, and they refuse to come to the table. So they spend, $20 or $30 million just getting a handful of legislative seats. They broke the supermajority, and now they're going to have forced family time. Those Republicans are going to have to come to the table and actually talk to Roy Cooper. And again, I can give you reverse sides. Supermajorities in Illinois with Ron or whatever. But my point is that redistricting is a really big problem. And I think you're going to see some forced family time in really key states. Governors can get things done. Coffers are getting a little bit more flush past the Great Recession, et cetera. And so, you're going to have I think you're going to have more, but my point is, it's happening at the state level.
Yeah.
Stuff gets done at the state level.
Just to not be like a buzzkill to that point, the 2 most popular politicians in America with 70% approval ratings are Republican governors in blue states.
Sandoval.
What's that?
Massachusetts?
Massachusetts, Charlie Baker and
But Sandoval should be thrown in there too.
So there you go. So perfect example. So and I think one of the things is that we're all drawn to this awesome minute-by-minute show, reality TV show called Washington, D.C. right now, and we obsess over the daily drama of that, and we fail to recognize that the states are the laboratories of democracy. They are places where it's either you balance the budget and you make sure that the schools are funded and that the roads are paved, or you go home. And I like that John is becoming more of a Republican, which is push all authority back to the states, push it down, right? Smaller federal government, and give people the control where it matters most back home.
So we'll end there. We'll have our own forced family time at lunch, and we're back here at 2:30 for the third panel of the day. Thank you.